Barely Emerging is recorded on the lands of the Kaurna people. We at Haunted Cow Collective acknowledge the Kaurna people and all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the sovereign custodians of this country. We pay our respects to elders past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Take a hammer to Jeff Koons.
The medium is the message.
Exactly, the medium is the message. It's not just throwing fucking Campbells on a Van Gogh. Like, that doesn't make any goddamn sense, you know?
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Barely Emerging. I'm Sid.
And I'm Francis, and we have a very exciting episode for you guys today. We are joined by a special guest, Riley O'Keefe. We had a really great conversation. We talked about everything from art and activism to art activism. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Riley O'Keefe.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Morning, girls.
Morning.
Good morning, Riley.
I felt like a student. Good morning,
Yeah.
Riley.
Oh, God. Yeah. All the like Vietnam flashbacks of being in primary school.
Yeah.
So we are talking about activism in art because we've had a lot of conversations about this. I think a lot of them, like we started talking about it, Sid, because of the Van Gogh soup throwing incident.
Yes, there seems to be a lot of social media posts about soup throwing on famous artworks, super gluing hands to frames and all that sort of stuff. So we kind of had a bit of a talk about what is activism in art, because we do know that there is a lot of activism in the actual art world, but there's also activism against art.
I think a big thing with the Van Gogh sunflower soup incident is that surely there is better ways to get your point across, you know, because if you've just thrown soup on something and then glued yourself to a wall and been all like, is art more important than food? Everyone's like, of course it's fucking not. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you're just pissing people off at that point. And then once you've pissed someone off, they don't want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I think that's a good point. And this also made its way, like, you know, my parents know about it because it's in the news. Like, it's very mainstream. It's out of the art bubble and very apparent to a lot of people who probably aren't climate activists or aren't art people, but they see old paintings being destroyed and get their back up pretty quickly.
And sometimes it's like, why that particular painting? You know, like that particular painting didn't have anything, to my knowledge, to do with their cause. You know, like
The Van Gogh you're talking about? Yeah.
It's like when people deface the Mona Lisa. They're like, what's a really beloved painting that we can just fuck with to get people talking about our cause?
Yeah.
But because you've like fucked with a beloved thing, people are just going to look at you as the villain constantly. So today we thought we'd take a bit of a look at the distinction between activist art, which is art made for the purpose of activism, and art colliding with activism. So activists who use pre-existing art as a way to amplify their reach. And I think the incident is a really good example of message and intent versus like execution.
Yeah.
Because there has been, you know, some really good examples of art colliding with activism. And I think people like the Van Gogh soup throwers have just tried to replicate it without any of the like backbone.
Yeah, such a theoretical gap between like the intent of that protest and the execution of it. Why Van Gogh? Why that museum? Like, you know, there has been protests against oil funding,
Yeah.
you know, the big art industrial complex, like all the institutions across the world, but they weren't focusing on the institution themselves or the painting for any reason. It wasn't even Van Gogh's an old white bastard or anything. Like, it was just really kind of misguided. And I think the risk it runs is like, if there's right-wingers that are already anti-climate change science or whatever, you're not convincing them, which should be the target market. You've also pissed off a bunch of lefties who are on your side. Who are museum goers, who are like climate change, maybe not activists, but, you know, at least understand the situation.
Yeah, the environmental causes are important at the moment, and I don't want that cause to be overshadowed by your actions. There's also the question of the media is actually reporting on you. So who controls the media?
I think that's the interesting thing as well. Like, that hit the mainstream. It's on Murdoch, it's on Guardian, it's ABC, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
There are other climate activists and protests that take place where people are actually standing in front of tankers, are doing all sorts of different things that you don't hear about. So I think there is like what would you call it? Like a media responsibility that they're going for clicks because that's going to enrage people.
And which ones are the ones that discredit the cause? Which ones are the ones that we can show? And
I think that's definitely got to be a factor in that. Yeah, you can sort of pass those people off as misguided idiots, which, in a lot of cases, I think that can be kind of true. I mean, I still think it's so funny. Like here in Adelaide, we got interrupted a few months ago by, I think it was XR, I think it was Extinction Rebellion, but managed to shut down War Memorial, Morfett Street, like blocked ambulances, all these kind of things. These people screaming "Just Stop Oil" while wearing a plastic raincoat, plastic boots, like it just shows the lack of thought there behind what they're actually getting to.
And that's a great point, because we actually, in the research for this episode, had found out that Just Stop Oil are sponsored by Gorilla Glue.
Gorilla Glue, very famously made of polyurethane, which is a microplastic.
That's so good. I did not know that, and that is really, really good. Yeah, amazing.
There is that ladder to it where people can only take the steps that they can take. You know, like you can choose to protest for climate, which, you know, we all encourage you to do. It's a very, very real, very like prevalent topic, but you need to actually look at what you are picketing for. It's all well and good to support a cause, but if you're going to march on the front lines to support that cause, you need to do your research about it.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's all well and good to say just stop oil because, you know, like stop oil. But if it's also like a major sponsor of Just Stop Oil is Gorilla Glue.
Yeah. What's the byproducts of oil?
Yeah.
I think both XR and XR is English in origin. I think Just Stop Oil might be the same. But I think the main point that they were making is bringing attention to the fact that the UK government was signing new oil licenses, which I had to read a bunch this week to actually pull that little bit out, spent time on the website, like to find that little bit. If you run with that as your slogan instead of Just Stop Oil, there might be a little bit more public engagement.
Yeah, what is there to grab onto? If the only thing that people can grab onto is that you've defaced some art, then your cause isn't going to go any further.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, there have been effective protests using art, like the Black Square at the Tay. For those that don't know, huge black square of material, which was referencing Malevich's Black Square, which in itself was a protest piece of art to sort of dismantle the bourgeois view of art. And they brought it into the gallery and they stood there with it silently and peacefully. Then they all stood under it and it was dragged up the stairs and out of the room. And they were protesting the institution itself. They weren't attacking art. They weren't attacking people. They were protesting the institution being funded by big oil.
And they were protesting the lack of transparency.
Yeah.
Yes,
exactly. It's like Malevich's Black Square, fantastic artwork within itself. But in this case, they were using it as this is like a censorship bar.
Yeah.
This is exactly what you're doing. And that was like a fantastic way to do it. Even, other historical examples of actually defacing artworks for your cause. Painting the Rokeby Venus by Diego Velázquez was slashed a few times to protest Emmeline Pankhurst, who was one of the leading figures in the suffragette movement, to protest her imprisonment. And that painting has a nude in recline. It was painted in I think the 1400s or something like that. And it's one of those old classic ones where it's just the woman doesn't have a face, it's just a booty, it's just a big ass on the canvas. And, they slashed that a few times and it did draw attention to the women's vote movement and women's desires to be seen as more than just that booty. But then Just Stop Oil, I think it was only a couple of years ago in 2014 or something, they defaced that same painting with a hammer. That has nothing to do with Just Stop Oil. The gallery that it's in didn't have much, to my knowledge, to do with the cause that they were talking about, but it was that piggybacking on this prior action, this other act of art activism that had caused a stir.
Without any second order thinking about what that actually means.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, even funnier, it wasn't in 2014, it was in 2023.
I thought it was later.
Yeah.
I was just going to say on top of that, speaking of Tay and the Malevich protest, I think that was a few years ago now, maybe 2016 or something. that was. Only 2 years ago, the Tate divested from Sackler money. And that came from the artist Nan Golden, who was addicted to opioids. She wrote a huge article. She's released a documentary. And it forced the Tate to say, okay, we're not going to take money from the Sackler family anymore. And that to me seems a very effective form of art protesting. Whereas we're going to get to a point where if you've got blue hair, you won't be let into a gallery. You know, if you come in high vis, you won't be let in.
Well, it's like you were saying with the Van Gogh incident. Like, I think that was, reported on like 9 News. So the only thing that people are seeing of this protest is that it's 2 young people, one of whom has pink hair, in just these T-shirts that say "Just Stop Oil" that have glued themselves. And that is so easy to discredit. Yeah. It's just a couple of, young people who don't know what they're talking about, who are just like kicking out at the world around them.
And also here we are like actually reflecting on their cause, understanding their cause, and kind of come to the same conclusion as the every man or woman who doesn't know art and doesn't know protesting.
Yeah.
Like they are kind of just misguided.
Yeah, when you do go onto the website, they've got soup days where they're talking about should we stay non-violent and all that sort of stuff. It's really hard going through their website and thinking, oh yeah, you're a cause I want to get behind, because when they have their news thing down at the bottom, it's like, look what our member did. They got into jail. Like they
have like a whole
who's in prison
law
right
section.
now. Yeah.
For like bailouts and stuff. And, there's a lot of money involved in this organisation as well. Something that I know the three of us discussed a little while ago was the Eileen Getty connection of the Getty oil fortune. So I want to look a bit further into that. And she funds multiple groups. She's never been involved directly in the oil industry apart from family money. So I think in my head I was a little bit more lenient. And then saw that including XR and Just Stop Oil, she's put about $4 million in. Yeah. And for context, last year she bought Brad Pitt's old house for $33 million. So I think if she really, really cared about the impact that her family had, maybe there's a little bit more money that could be used towards that.
Yeah.
But then you question, like, where that $4 million that Eileen Getty has put forward is funding these protests, not funding anything else that might help, whether it's planting trees or, like, building recycling factories or whatever you could possibly do that has some kind of material input instead of just, like, a theoretical... I read over the last few days, multiple people who are involved with Just Stop Oil to begin with have just stepped completely out because unfortunately we live in the fucking culture war, and all of them have said, like, anything that gives anti-climate change people any sort of fuel is not worth doing. That's just the reality. Yeah. And I think this is the ultimate one to give fuel to that.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it really just like blurs the line of intent and like just it detracts from your message, and it makes it really easy to dismiss because, you are just giving everyone on the opposition so much fuel, by engaging in like not well thought out or just like sloppy activism. If you can pull one thread and the whole thing falls apart, then you're fucked pretty much.
Yeah, especially when you're attacking something that still exists. It's one of the nice things that we still have. You know? Go into a free museum and see like some of the best art in the world.
Yeah. And for my money too, like, Van Gogh was just a struggling dude. Like,
he never made any money.
He didn't make any money.
Decrepit and poor.
He was decrepit and poor. He had half an ear. He got shot to death by a 12-year-old allegedly. Like, come on, man.
I mean, if you want to throw some paint on some Salvador Dali sculptures, like, go for it.
Yeah.
Take a hammer to Jeff Koons. Like, how much plastic and metal and all shit is that guy fucking raking up? Like, really hit it to the people that are doing the damage, not some long dead artist who never made a dent.
And I think back to what we were saying before, like things like the Black Square protest I didn't know about until just earlier this week.
Yeah.
The Nan Golden thing I'd been following for a little bit because I followed the Sackler story.
Yeah.
But like those things...
I followed Nan Golden,
Yeah, I followed her around.
Yeah.
But like those things were effective, yet they get way down the page on any news site. Even if you do hear about them, they're certainly not on Channel 9 News.
No.
You know, maybe you'll get them in the New York Times or something, if that. But
you have to be the special sort of person that will dig for their news.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which these days is like really hard to do.
Yeah.
It is, and especially with things like activism, not all publicity is good publicity. You know, you can't even use that. You can't just be like, okay, well, we're going to deface a really famous painting because it's going to, you know, draw people to our cause, because it's not. It's going to make people dismiss your cause. It's going to make you seen as like hysterical and misguided and all the things that we've called them today, you know.
And I think we're in a kind of environment now where you could pull that off perfectly and do the perfect protest, and if it's enough to create a news buzz, you're going to be pasted with a bad brush anyway.
Yeah.
Like that's how it works. So you can't go out knowing full well that it is kind of misguided in a way.
And I think even if you're not misguided, media will make a way to twist it so it looks like you are. When the MoMA shut down for like pro-Palestine, that was an example of a really well done protest. It also kind of occurred, I think, concurrently in the Hamburger Bahndorf in Berlin, which was like another gallery. And pro-Palestine protesters interrupted a performance of like a 100-hour round-the-clock reading of The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is performed by Tanya Bruguera. And it's not just her reading it for the whole 100 hours. You can sign up to take part in the reading. You know, it's like a collaborative piece. And some of the activists like used their allotted time, like they signed up to be a part of the reading, but instead of reading for the thing, they spoke their piece about Palestine. And it was reported in the media of they took advantage of the performance to use hashtag hate speech. And, you know, it was like interrupted between, you know, these times and used violent hate speech towards one of the other readers and one of the museum directors. And Tanya Bruguera had to come on and set the record straight and just be like, they didn't interrupt anything. You know, she's just like,
they did good.
She's like, I shut it down. They said what needed to be said. Like, don't put words in my mouth.
It's also such a perfect example of like how to actually think about what you're dealing with. Like, what are the parameters of this environment? We're in a gallery. We're talking about whatever it happens to be, whether it's Palestine or oil or whatever. I think a lot of the Just Stop Oil stuff seems so removed from reality.
Yeah.
Like, and I think there probably is a bit of a like social contagion bubble in that group that they don't see things any other way because it's so clear to them that it is one way. With that protest at the MoMA and at Hamburger Bahnhof, it's like they've understood the parameters of this completely.
Exactly.
They've done it peacefully. They've done it effectively.
And they've also done it in a way that makes sense.
Yes.
Like,
yes, exactly.
The Origins of Totalitarianism it was like an in-depth analysis of the social conditions that led to Nazi and Soviet totalitarian regimes.
The medium is the message.
Exactly.
Like,
the medium is the message. It's not just throwing fucking Campbells on a Van Gogh. Like, that doesn't make any goddamn sense, you know?
yeah, I think that's really, really perfect. Perfect example. We were talking about a few other good examples of art where it's gone right, like using art, not art as protest, but using art.
I mean, one of the ones that is always brought up in universities is the Guerrilla Girls. They're the ones that have just stomped their way in and really given the big figures of, you know, women not being a part of the art world. And one of the messages that they come across is using humour is probably one of the best ways to do it as well.
If you can make people laugh, you can slip in whatever the fuck you want, you know?
I can't remember if it's a George Carlin quote or if he was stealing it from someone, but if you're going to tell them the truth, you better make them laugh.
Yeah.
But yeah, people would ask, isn't it a bit weird that, you know, you're putting on the walls of a gallery what that gallery doesn't do for your demographic? And they go, no, that's hilarious. We love putting the gallery's missteps on their own walls. It's amazing.
Which is also another reason it worked.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's like actually calling out the institution by showing them what they're not doing and showing other patrons what this gallery isn't doing. To go back to the pro-Palestine protest, it's why that was done so well. They didn't come in and gluing themselves to shit and yelling. It's like they handed out pamphlets that were designed to look like the museum's pamphlets. But, you know, if you read this thing, you'd get some information about it. And then I think just in the atrium, it was like they just unfurled a banner that just says the trustees fund genocide.
You can see why they're using the method that they're using and the vehicle that they're using to do that. It's really clear. But when you go with the just oil, just oil. Like just all the oil. Just all the oil. When you look at just stop oil, you get confused. You get really confused and you just don't understand. And that makes you frustrated and that makes you angry.
Mm-hmm.
Well, something I wanted to talk to you two about, like talking about oil divestment from art institutions. Don't use it on your phone. It's a nightmare. It's almost a nightmare in browser. But it's an amazing map that a group put together. It's called Maps of Gratitude, Cones of Silence, and Lumps of Coal. And it is essentially a huge web linking all arts institutions in Australia that are connected to big oil in some way or another, whether that's direct sponsorship or board member sponsorship. But just in Australia, it is like staggering the amount of our arts funded by that industry. And if you want to do the second order thinking, my brain ticks and goes, okay, what if they weren't funding those institutions? Do we still have them? Because that to me is kind of more terrifying, that you only get to have art if it's funded by big oil companies or executives. And that requires a whole different level of thinking and activism and planning.
Because big oil wants their name on that wall. They want to art wash.
We have a term for it, you know?
Yeah. They really want to be connected to people who are seen to be doing things and speaking out against big oil.
Yeah.
So it feels really, really like icky that they are the ones funding what you say about them.
I had a conversation with a friend a few years ago. I think we were just at a cafe and flicking through the newspaper, and he's a muso, art adjacent and art sympathetic, but not an art guy per se. And there was a huge ad for Tarnanti. And in the corner was the BHP logo. And he knew I'd studied, and he said to me, like, Tarnanti's sponsored by BHP. And I just kind of nodded at him, and he could not fucking believe it. You couldn't find two more opposing forces to come together. And the truth of the matter is, unless that money comes from somewhere else that isn't BHP, there's no Tarnanti. Like, how do we actually deal with that?
Yeah.
So I think throwing soup on paintings is a shit way to deal with it. As I've said to you a few times, said this to friends, like, we are supposed to be creative thinkers. Like, that's what sets us aside from the rest of society. We have to think creatively about this shit to work out a way to have art without that.
Yeah.
We have the Museum of Economic Botany. It's in the Botanic Gardens. It's wonderful. Like, it's a beautiful building. They have exhibitions, I think, every few months. The Australian chapter of XR, Extinction Rebellion, recently they protested. They didn't throw paint on anything, but they protested the Museum of Economic Botany being sponsored by Santos. But my first question was, okay, where's the money come from?
Exactly.
And I'm not condoning that sponsorship.
Absolutely not.
But if that protest says, like, hey, we could easily get this money from X, Y, and Z, and they're willing to give it, and they're not connected to, like, destructive industry, great, let's do that. But without a solution, like, you can't just tell them to divest and then the museum shuts down.
Yeah.
And we don't have it.
Exactly. It's a hard grapple.
It is, especially because, I mean, particularly in South Australia, like, the monopoly is so one-sided. You know, it's like money comes from these two ass big companies, or it comes from a bunch of little guys crowdfunding.
Yeah.
And
who's going to get squashed every time?
Who's going to get squashed every time? And who has the money to crowdfund if they don't have the money from elsewhere, which is probably also funded by BHP and Santos?
Exactly. You know? Yeah. As you work your way up the chain or down the chain, you're going to find it somewhere.
Yeah.
And, you know, you can very well innocently take money from somewhere that, you know, you've worked hard to get this grant or get this thing, not knowing that the strings are tied to somewhere, and then you're doing an art piece about, you know, oil on my shoes or some shit like that. I don't know. Yeah. That's a good title for an artwork.
I was going to say a map between fossil fuels and the arts, this website.
It's like your conspiracy buddy with red string everywhere all over the wall, except it's between galleries and oil companies. I've actually got just a tiny little quote on the Maps of Gratitude from the ex-mayor of Yarra in Melbourne. She said, "What about the impact on the arts? It's not just about money. These associations to people and brands inform the culture of our institutions. From the way the workplace operates to which artists are supported, they can influence who tells a story and influence our shared culture. Are we still willing to accept their money and their governance, in exchange grant them, the fossil fuel industry, their social license to operate?" Which I think is like really really getting to the core. It's not just these institutions are funded by dark money, because guess what? Every fucking corner of the world is funded by dark money.
It's called money laundering.
Exactly. But the fact that that money impacts culture, as you were saying, Sid, and I think you guys mentioned it a little bit in the funding episode, that like where that money comes from is going to dictate what art you can do. I mean, we talked about Mike Parr at Anna Schwartz's gallery. They've had a 35-year relationship, and he writes a handful of words that gets him booted, gone, done, dusted, relationship over. And I think, that's another interesting thing, that Just Stop Oil can keep doing what they do because they're ineffective. In my opinion, I think that can just keep happening because guess what? They're doing us a favor, really. Whereas something like an artist standing up and going, Nan Goldin refused to show her work in the Tate and they wanted to, so they divested.
Yeah. If we're going into activism and conspiracies, there's this whole big thing that Just Stop Oil is actually oil companies that are trying to like discredit that. And it's like the more you look into it, I mean, to my brain anyway, I'm like, I can say that.
That's why I wanted to find out, where is Eileen Getty actually putting her money? But I mean, even if that $4 million is fairly inconsequential and it's coming from a good place, the results look pretty similar to me. If it was being, and that tactic's been used since the Second World War. If there is a group that shows a threat to an established power, infiltrate it. It's the easiest way. Control your opposition. I think when you really see people like thrown out, not that Mike Parr's going to be like struggling without Anna Schwartz, but when you really see something that drastic, that's probably someone who A, is hitting on something, and B, can't be infiltrated or controlled.
It's someone that is saying the quiet part a little bit too loud.
Louder than silently.
Exactly.
Louder than they're not dead yet.
Really quickly, the fossil fuels and the arts roadmap, the website URL is Fossil Fuels the Arts. And I love that even more.
That's good, isn't it?
Yeah. Fossil Fuels the Arts. And it's like, it does.
Yeah.
And I do want to go back and say, yes, do not look at this on your mobile. I tried to. It's really hard. Go on a computer.
It's hard. You want like a joystick and a projector.
You want a really good Zoom function.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it is worth a look. That whole group have been doing this work for a few years now, and it is really cool.
And you can really tell that there is a lot of work into this. To be able to find those lines, it's really hard research.
And I mean, back to that and the sort of futility of divesting fossil fuels from the art, like what do you do outside of protesting, or if you are an artist and you want to make activist art, but what do you do? Like if a population said, we're not attending the Art Gallery of South Australia, we're not going anymore. Like at what point does that become an actual movement? And I think that's where Just Stop Oil are this kind of a cliquey, exclusive, group. And I think any social change has to come from like a societal movement, not just like a group.
And I guess the only thing that you can do is your own movements and your own morals within how you conduct yourself and how you move forward and what you probably give back as well. Say there may be areas where you can put your art. That doesn't mean you have to go into a gallery. There are ways that you don't have to pay the big man to be shown. Then what happens? You get to say whatever the fuck you want to say.
Yeah.
But then 10 people see it as opposed to 100,000 people that see it.
Yes, and that's the trade-off, isn't it?
And the start.
Yeah.
Well, what I was ramping to was, you're correct, like big change doesn't happen with 5 people overnight.
No.
It takes a real big societal change, and those things take decades. Unfortunately, with things like that, it's a grind.
Yeah.
It's people realizing, oh, hang on, this shit's fucked. And then it's just like a new generation of people that are just like, oh, we're going to stop doing this, you know?
And when the bug is this insidious little oil bug that has been there for so long and has really dug their heels into something, it's a really hard one to squash.
Yeah. It's like the creationism in schools. It's just like in places where that was so deep rooted, it's been so hard to just stamp it the fuck out.
Damien Hirst called a certain event the greatest artwork of all time. And if you want an activist artwork that changed everything overnight, it's it. He was talking about 9/11. And he called it the greatest artwork of all time.
We're keeping that in because I have no respect for Damien Hirst.
Oh,
And,
no, yeah.
and if you kind of look at it as protest against American imperialism, pretty effective as an activist piece of art.
It's annoying because there are ways to make that make sense.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
And it's like all...
He copped the appropriate amount of shit for it.
Yeah.
But, what did happen from that is a surveillance society. So that's like kind of not it.
Yeah, and also more imperialism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we can happily say
Excellent flight security for a few years though.
Oh, yeah.
I think with activism in art and how it's done and how you can do it well, one of the biggest barriers that I think is just cause fatigue. I think the more people see like activism art, Riley, you've expressed this sentiment at some point where it feels like you can't make an artwork now unless it has a meaning.
Mm-hmm.
You can't make an artwork unless it's about something. But then I think the flip side of that is people they encounter something and they're just like, for lack of a better word, just fatigued by it all. If we go back to the like pro-Palestine protests and stuff, even if you make a work that is like pro-Palestine, there's always going to be someone in the comments being like, well, what about the tragedy in like Sudan? You know?
Which is kind of the equivalent of me pointing out the plastic gumboots on the Just Stop Oil protester. It is that kind of thing. And yeah, you're right. Like, you can't not have a smartphone.
Yeah.
They're made by slaves. Reality. It's inescapable unless you want to Ted Kaczynski out in the woods, which
I don't know if I want to be on record saying it's looking more and more inviting. But there's even things like, and I don't even know if we can call it a movement, but the Renoir socks thing.
Oh, yeah.
There was like a group of people that were like protesting, I suppose. Like they stood out the front of, I can't even remember which gallery it was. This is how much airtime it got. But they stood out the front of a gallery just with picket signs saying like, we're not iconoclasts, Renoir just sucks at painting. And it was this whole thing that they were just going after this classical artist because, there are better painters out there.
Also, you are just being iconoclasts. That's exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, like the guy who organised it said it was about how many old white guys there are in galleries and how Renoir as a person was like, he had anti-Semitic views and all this kind of stuff. So I think...
But all that came later, right? When he was asked to kind of justify what this movement was.
Like, there's water to what you said about how it feels like every artwork needs to have some deeper meaning. But I think a lot of that is ascribed to it later by the artist when they feel like they need to justify the work that they've made.
Totally.
They need to justify, like why this thing deserves the attention that it's getting.
Yeah, or like you make something that people generally quite like and then you're put on the spot of like, well, what does it represent? And you're like, well, I just made it in the studio because I thought it was cool, but now I'm saying that the pink is about this and the hard edge is about that.
Yeah.
It's like people promoting a movie and they're like, what's your stance on LGBT youth? And you're like, I'm here to promote Oppenheimer. Like, I don't know.
Like, that's what I'm kind of interested in because I think more and more of it is like they're no longer just making work and if they get poked, they'll come up with something fluffy about it. It's the main driver.
Yeah.
But to the point where like, are we even making good art anymore?
Yeah.
Or are we just like getting a bunch of stuff and as long as the 3,000 word essay like nails the thing home, then the art is kind of secondary to the idea which is usually
And I'm sorry, I'm not very good at writing essays. Can I be an artist if I can't write a big essay about my work? And when someone actually like asks me a question about it, I go, I don't know. Please stop talking to me.
Well, and that's kind of it. Like, it's so hyper academicized.
Yeah.
When we were supposed to be taking it in the other direction, the art was supposed to be less bourgeois, more open to public. But now, you have to kind of have a degree in social politics and like just to understand what I'm saying.
Where's my clickbait about this artwork? How can I sell this on social media so that I can get views for it?
And I think that's probably the driver. Like, you're no longer saying, here's the painting I did of X, Y, and Z, or here's the sculpture I made that touches on, or just saying, here's a work I made. You're branding yourself. Like, that's what it is. Like, you're an artist with views, with notions, with ideas, and that's the work. Like, that's what all of the energy goes into instead of the energy going into the studio.
There's times where, obviously I do make a lot of feminist sort of art. What is it, chicken or the egg? Am I making feminist art because I'm a woman? Or am I making feminist art because I want to make feminist art?
Or are you just making art
Or am I
that's
just
labelled
making
feminist because you're a woman?
Exactly. Like, if I don't want to make one piece of art about, why women this, blah, 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 is it just going to be pigeonholed as feminism because I've done that before?
I can't remember if it was Joan Mitchell or another female painter, which I guess makes me a bastard for not remembering.
Cancelled.
But she was asked in an interview, like, what's it like being a female painter? She said, well, for a start, I'm just a painter.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm a painter, not a woman painter.
Yeah.
I just got a quote from this article on exactly what you were saying, Sid. This is Yvonne Lake, who's an artist and a writer, and she was talking about kind of the failure of activism in artwork, not the Just Stop Oil kind, but activism as art. She said the reliance on language to explain artworks can have a negative impact, though not least because of the much derided nature of impenetrable art speak, meta-mechanical rhizomatic permutations, anyone? The requirement to write about art has created an overdependence on language and rhetoric, which has in turn led to the creation and curation of artworks that dictate a specific message rather than allowing the viewer to draw her own conclusions. However, the problem with this kind of activism is that it states the obvious and only succeeds in perpetuating the same modes it sets out to lambast, the voyeuristic nature of viewing others suffering. Which I think is so perfect, because I think I've seen it even on a local level that so many of these like cause style shows, like they're not raising money for the cause. It's artworks about the cause. And it just does become like, look at this suffering. Look at this problem.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, if I can get more out of a 500-word op-ed in The Guardian than from your show, it failed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? It failed. You're not dragging in the people who you're trying to convince. You're dragging in the people who already agree with you and will pat you on the back for doing a good job.
And it feels sort of like the auditions of the fucking music shows where like whoever has the biggest sob story wins.
I was going to get back to like the cause fatigue of it all. And I think that does come down to over-education in art, because the Turner Prize winner, his work, it was like, bollards and tape and all this kind of like trolleys and just like random shit. And it was, everyone toted it as being about like Brexit and stuff. But then I think reading what he had to say about it, he was just like, if people think it's about Brexit, that's great. I just use I'm working with materials and space and what I have available to me. But it's like the way in which he was articulating himself, it's kind of like, oh, you've never suffered a day in your fucking life. It's like people that see this like common materials, it's just like how many people that are protesting or are like living rough on streets and stuff and do have those like crowd control things, like homeless spikes and stuff like that do impact their day-to-day life. And this motherfucker's talking down to them from his like Oxford education.
With £25,000 in his back pocket.
£25,000 in his back pocket. He lives in Berlin.
2 prestigious art schools.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's like this thing that could have potentially been a great piece of, art activism or activist art in some like way, like talking about the steep decline of Britain, just became this other like guy talking down to people.
It felt that way. Like, even though he, there was a couple of interviews I read and he hit all of these little kind of markers, he said all the right things like, oh, it's cost of living and it's class warfare and it's this and it's that. It's like, yeah, but you're like university reading groups aren't achieving anything. Like, understanding that doesn't make the work good, nor does it actually help the cause in any way whatsoever.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things that I read from him as well was he was like, I'm not interested in art at the moment. I'm interested in like theology and stuff.
Why the fuck are you making art then?
Back to what we were saying before, it's like understanding the environment, like understanding that your little art academic bubble isn't actually reflective of like what's happening on the ground with real people. And you can know about it and you can internalize it and talk about it, but you can't understand it.
This goes back to what you just said before about how the people that are going to come and see your little show about, how homeless women don't have access to tampons. The people that you're bringing in are already like, fuck yeah, why don't they? You're not reaching a bigger audience. So I think a lot of way modern art activism hasn't taken off in the way that it has previously is because artists in this echo chamber of other academicized artists doesn't really go anywhere. And then the ones that do filter through to a wider public that can, have the numbers and the momentum to actually do this big societal shift that needs to happen in certain areas, you just get the hysterical just stop oil people.
Yeah, or they're captured by the institution, entirely. Yeah.
Captured by the institution entirely. And I think it does come back to cause fatigue, because people that aren't within those bubbles, they're hearing all these different plights and opinions from every pocket. It's like on social media, it's on their phones, it's on TVs, it's on everywhere.
And it's like that fatigue that you're talking about doesn't come from the fatigue of the things happening themselves. It's from the it being pointed out constantly.
Exactly.
And a lot of the time I see stuff from friends or people I follow and just think what are you talking about?
Yeah.
You've either cherry picked or you're just nixing a whole bunch of other information.
When someone says all the right buzzwords, you can't say
when
anything
they
about those.
hit those taste clusters.
Exactly. Those taste clusters,
It is hard because we've taken a fat shit on Just Stop Oil this podcast, but we should stop oil.
Yeah.
Wait, I thought we were a far right wing.
But it's this is what we're talking about. We've brought them up so much because they're the ones that have filtered through the shit.
Yeah.
And it's like you're saying, when you're bombarded by this kind of stuff from every angle, the voices that get louder than the collective cacophony of everyone on social media talking about 8 different traumas at once is usually the ridiculous ones, the ones that detract from their cause or dismiss their cause, or they're the lightning rod that other people use to be all I'm so sick of everything having to be about something, I'm so sick of hearing about all this shit, and I think that is why it's really hard to find good activism art now. And it's you can find it for sure, but you have to dig through layers and layers of CNN.
And like you were saying before, anyone that gets a big enough platform to make a point to a wider audience is often you get the institution capture, which says you can't do that.
Yeah.
Back to Mike Parr, perfect example.
There's always some publicist in the wings that is just cringing.
Yeah. I mean, I heard someone describe the culture war as basically the worst 5% of both sides fighting against each other.
Yeah.
And that's what you see in the news, on Twitter, on Instagram. That is the war. I think any one of us could have a conversation with someone and be what a nice person. But you find out they're a conservative and all of a sudden it's what a piece of shit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we've just been so conditioned into that thinking. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of this comes from that kind of conditioning as well. The institutions showing people with a story to tell, whether it's their heritage or their whatever it is, and not to discredit that at all. That's been happening for years and years and years. Young artists see that, smaller galleries see that, and it filters down. And so I see it here, students want to make work about themselves and their experience of the world. And that is valid. But it gives them this certain funnel to work inside that they don't branch out of.
What I call it is year 12 art. When you feel like you don't have anything, you're a white privileged person and you don't have anything to put out there as this cause, you start grabbing these things that, are going to get people's attention.
I think that's a huge part of it. Something I've definitely noticed being a student here and then being on the other side of that, as a staff member. When I went through as a student, we had a great cohort. A lot of us, got along and we formed a little group and we were putting on shows. But 2 or 3 times a week, we would be at the pub swapping books. Oh, check this out, whether it's a theorist or a painter or whatever. We were so engaged. It was really being plugged into the fucking matrix where you're just just keep it coming at me.
Yeah.
Because we had come to art school to be artists. So many of students now, and I talk to friends who work in Melbourne as well, art schools, undergrad students are no longer coming to art school to do art. Well, they are, of course, it's art school, but they want to self-express. And this is the best avenue that they have found. So they're not taking an interest in history, context. These are the things that are missing from often misguided, single point issues. when you don't have that history and don't have that context, like, oh, Renoir sucks, like, good on you. But also it's like a peg in the history of how we got here and therefore is significant, you know? And so I think a lot of it is about what you're talking about. It's this, like, I'm grabbing this, I'm grabbing that. And it's about how I feel about those things.
Wait, you're allowed to feel those things. You're allowed to have those feelings.
But is it good art?
But is it good art? Exactly. Yeah.
And there are ways to do it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I mentioned to you guys during the week, one of my all-time favorites, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Mexican artist, made a bunch of piles of candy, printout stacks, billboards. All the work was so deeply personal. It was about him and his partner who had died of AIDS, who was alive for a lot of his career. So deeply personal, so deeply political given the climate of that illness at the time. Yet they're perfect works of minimal art. Like, they're perfect. I think a lot of the stuff now is so Instagramified, like it's so algorithmed that it's formulaic. And it does like two bad things, which is not making a good, engaging piece of work and not actually getting a message across that you intend to.
Exactly.
Just thinking that Tanya Bruguera has a work, and often I think some of the best pieces of activist art are pretty minimalist.
Yeah.
Like, she has a great work, and it's like a performance piece called Tatlin's Whisper No. 5. And the whole thing was it's just two mounted police officers. They were two horses, two cops, and they were just ushering patrons around a gallery. And her whole thing was like, you know, because she's Cuban, growing up in that like oppressed political climate. And a lot of her work is to do with like surveillance state as well. But it was just that like really transferable thing of people will respond if there is a looming threat or, you know, an authority figure or something in front of them.
There was a show at the Experimental Art Foundation many years ago before it was Ace Open. It was the entire gallery, empty, no walls, stark light, and it was what looked like just a thread from one wall to the other. The most minimal work I've ever seen. And so you look at it and you're trying to work out what the thread is made of. It's a bit messy. It's a bit whatever. And the title, which I also can't remember, just the crux, but like basically what it was the hair of corpses who were part of a genocide that had taken place. And it was the real hair, and it was all stitched together to make this line across. And it didn't need a 3,000 word screed. It needed the title. And I remember taking Mum there, and she kind of went, you know, the furrowed brow of like, oh yeah, contemporary art, this string. And as soon as she read the title, it hit her in the guts.
Yes.
And like, I think you bang on, Francis, like that minimalism is often a really important part of like something being effective, because you can actually let it settle on you instead of being lectured at that you have to think all of these things.
And we've definitely talked about that before. Shameless self-plug, the titles episode, where the title can be so important to an artwork.
Or it can shit on it.
Or it can shit all over it. Yeah, exactly.
And I'm really loving Tanya Bruguera. I'm going to bring her up again. But she has another great work. It's called Untitled, but in parentheses, like Havana. And it was like this dark tunnel-like space in like a former military prison, like it was made to look like that. And on the floor of it, there was just a layer of like rotting sugarcane husks. So there's really like pungent smelling, you know, like sugarcane, obviously a huge export for Cuba. So visitors would walk down this long tunnel and then they would think they'd see a light at the end of the tunnel. But when they got there, it was actually a TV screen playing speeches by Fidel Castro. Yeah. And it's like, when they turned back to leave, the light from that TV that they couldn't see before was illuminating these like male figures in the shadows. So again, it was like consistently getting watched.
I mean,
such good work.
There's a few people in my life that I talk to about this kind of shit. And one phrase that we use a lot is the art thing. And the art thing is like the thing that an artwork does to you. Like the thing that happens when the Rothko just like takes up your field of vision. And it's happened to me at the dumbest things. A Frederick McCubbin painting, like colonial Australia, here we are, but this thing hit me in the guts. And it does the art thing. All those works like do the art thing. And I like less and less am I having that art impact me like that.
No, absolutely. And I think for me at least, it is like the Instagram effect. And I always fucking come back to Instagram as like like the seed of all evil when it comes to art, because it desensitizes you in a weird way where it's like, if you just saw a picture of some of these things, like if you saw a picture of the installation that was in the experimental art thing and it was just like pretty well an empty room and then like that line. You just keep flicking, you just keep going. And I think it's the same with the activism art or art activism and that cause fatigue of, unless people are actually going out of their way to see it in a gallery, it's not going to do the art. But then it's like, if it does at all. And then it's like, but trying to get people into galleries now, I think there's a real small pocket of people that actually go out of their way to go to like little independent galleries.
Yeah, definitely.
Most of them will go to the big ones, and that's the BHP Santos font. And the circle repeats.
You have Ace Open, which is the in-between, right, of very small galleries and big galleries. Like, they rely on government funding, they rely on private benefactors, and they've basically had to like brand themselves as a brand and have a font and tote bags and do all of that to keep it afloat. That's a big problem. ACE exists because two former galleries were forced to close down because the government said, we can only fund one of you. You guys do it. You make up who it is,
Yeah, and then like you say, the galleries that are remaining, it's that forced assimilation into like, okay, well, we're going to need to bend our program to suit the benefactors, otherwise we're just not going to have a space.
And fairly safe and ineffective activism is really good for a brand. Like, it is really good for funding bodies. It's good to have something that you can public face, basically, to, get those cred points. And not that I'm saying all of it is just that, because it isn't, but...
And it's not to discredit those people that are the cred points as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because, you're crazy if you think they're all just in it for some dirty game or something. Yeah. Like, it definitely comes from somewhere genuine. But, boy, it's tough. Like, it's really tough to do that effectively.
Yeah, privatisation. It's a hard thing.
And I think what I was saying before, there has to be new ways. Like, we can sit here and beg the government for money and then make the art that they say is okay, or we come up with new ways to show work that is actually just not institutionalized at all. It's like decentralizing that system to make it more accessible, more democratic, more effective, hopefully.
And how do we use the vehicles against those people? Like, how do we use Instagram the way that we want to do it instead? So I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much, Riley, for coming on.
Absolute pleasure.
We do want to leave this episode to say that we're not saying don't protest, or we're not saying don't do protest art, but definitely have a look at how you can do it in a meaningful way.
Any final thoughts?
And that's it. Thanks for having me. Can't wait for the next one.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us today.
Bye.
Bye.
And came out with a banger episode.
You've been listening to Barely Emerging, a podcast by Haunted Cow Collective. You can find us on our website at hauntedcow.com.au, at our Instagram at Barely Emerging, or on YouTube and Instagram at Haunted Cow Collective. This podcast is made by emerging artists for emerging artists, and together we are Barely Emerging.